It is September 1940. High in the mountains between France and Spain, an asthmatic, 48-year-old Jewish man is being smuggled across the border on foot, fleeing for his life. The Nazis have taken Paris, and if they catch him, he will be sent to his death. He clutches a black briefcase he will let no one else touch. Inside is a manuscript he says is worth more than his own life. When he finally reaches the border, the Spanish guards deliver a death sentence. In the morning, he will be sent back to Nazi-occupied France, and from there to the camps. That night, in a small hotel room, he takes his own life. The briefcase vanishes, and the manuscript inside will not surface for decades. Yet, the ideas inside the mind of this gentle, doomed man would go on to reshape how the modern world understands art, history, and memory itself. But above all, he left us a desperately timely prophecy, a chilling revelation of how fascism takes hold and why liberalism will always be powerless to stop it. This is the extraordinary story of Walter Benjamin. Chapter 1. The World That Made Him. In the last years of the 19th century, Berlin was a city in the throes of reinvention, tearing down its old skin and growing a new one at a feverish pace. Germany itself was barely older than a child. For centuries, it had been a scattered patchwork of separate kingdoms and duchies, dozens of small states, each going its own way. Then, in 1871, they were stitched together into a single empire, and Berlin became the capital of it all. When that happened, 800,000 people called the city home. By the turn of the century, that number had swollen past 2 million, and Berlin had become the most modern place in all of Europe. The change came on quickly. The iron tracks of the Berlin City Railway, finished in 1882, sliced clean through the heart of the city, their bare rails running past a jumble of buildings that had no business standing together. The streets that had once carried the soft roll of horse-drawn carriages were overtaken almost overnight by the clatter of streetcars and the low industrial growl of motor cars. Mass advertising arrived all at once, 50 years after Paris had grown used to it and washed over the city centre in a flood of factory-made goods. In 1896, Berlin's first grand department store, Wertheim, opened its doors on the Leipziger Platz, one of the great bustling public squares at the city's centre. It rose under an enormous glass roof, with a soaring atrium inside and some 83 escalators carrying shoppers up and up. Into this exact moment, the very instant German urban life was being born, a boy arrived. His name was Walter Benjamin, and he came into the world on the 15th of July, 1892. His family was upper middle class, German, and Jewish, and they lived in the Tiergarten district, an affluent central neighborhood. One observer called their world the last true elite of bourgeois Berlin. They were people who held wealth, and it showed. Walter's father, Emil, was a prosperous and imposing man, descended from merchants. He'd lived in Paris before settling in Berlin to build his fortune, working first as an auctioneer before buying his way out to become a high-stakes speculator holding various investments. He was a connoisseur of luxury, a man who could judge the exact quality of a carpet through the thin soles of his shoes simply by pressing his foot to the floor. As the family's money compounded, they drifted ever westward into grander homes, entirely sealed off from the poverty of Berlin's East End and its densely packed working-class slums. Young Walter knew nothing of that other city. As one account of his childhood put it, for rich children of his generation, the poor simply lived at the back of beyond. Sorry for the interruption. I'd like to take a moment to thank all our YouTube members and Patreons. Your solidarity translates directly into more videos more often. If you're able to support us, you'll find links to our Patreon in the video description. If not, please like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps other curious minds discover the channel. Thank you. Now, back to the story. The household he grew up in ran with flawless precision, kept in motion by a large domestic staff of nannies, a French governess, cooks, and maids. At its centre sat his mother, and her place at the sewing table became a seat of strange authority, radiating a magic that often curdled into something oppressive, especially when she made the boy stand perfectly still while she mended his clothes. Walter waged a silent, instinctive little rebellion against this domestic kingdom. On errands through the city, he would drag his feet and linger a half-step behind her, to her endless exasperation. He was determined, he wrote, never to form a united front with anyone, not even his own mother. That refusal to fall into line went deeper than childish stubbornness, and it would shape the whole of his life. The family's wealth became an incubator for a hungry, hypersensitive imagination, turning Walter into what he later called a genius of dwelling, a boy who mapped the secret inner life of ordinary things. He felt a strange compulsion to take on the likeness of the objects around him, weaving himself into heavy curtains or vanishing into the wood of hefty doors. He read the material world as though it were a text, where a rolled-up sock or the soft pop of a gas lamp carried secret tidings to anyone patient enough to listen. Technology felt intimate to him, too. The family's new telephone had arrived in the house at the same time he did, so he decided he and the machine were twins. He would press his head between its heavy earphones to listen to the static it produced, as well as his own heartbeat throbbing. Every object and routine and room reinforced the same beautiful illusion that the foundations of this life were as eternal and unshakable as the earth. This whispering, dreaming, deeply private world could only shelter him for so long, however. Just beyond the leafy edges of the West End stood the Kaiser Friedrich Gymnasium, a great red-brick educational institution. It was the disciplinary arm of the Prussian state, a place of canings and rigid drills and forced obedience, built to strip away the inner life of every pupil and forge him into a hardened imperial citizen. And toward that machine of uniformity, the boy who whispered to telephones was about to be sent. Chapter 2. The Golden Child Who Couldn't Function. In 1901, the 9-year-old Walter entered the German school system. From the moment he stepped inside, he felt the doors close behind him. On that very first day, something in him recoiled. He came to think of himself as a prisoner there, and the warden was the school clock. It hung over everything, ticking off the hours, watching him without rest. He hated the crush of bodies on the stairwells, the noise and the smell of so many boys packed together, the teachers droning their lessons into the air. The drilling went deep. Years afterward, he could still feel it. A set of words and verses pressed into him like a shape stamped into wax that had cooled and gone hard. That, he said, was the imprint of a great crowd colliding with one small self. His parents watched and worried. The boy was forever falling ill, forever frail, and by 1904 they had seen enough. They pulled him out of Berlin altogether and sent him into the countryside, to a boarding school. It was expensive and progressive. His parents hoped that with fresh air and open fields to frolic about him, a sturdier sort of child would come home at the end of it. That is not at all what they got. The boarding school did not make Walter into an outdoorsman. What it did was set his mind permanently alight, and the spark had a name: Gustav Wyneken. He was a teacher there, an educational reformer, the kind of man who wanted to tear up the old ways of schooling and start again. And he had built a whole philosophy around young people, a movement he called youth culture. The moment young Walter heard him lay it out, the whole course of his life bent toward it. What Wyneken taught went something like this. Childhood was not a waiting room or some hallway you hurried down on your way to becoming a proper adult. Youth was its own thing entirely, a creative force, a moral vanguard standing head and shoulders above the tired, settled complacency of grown men. To a sensitive boy who had felt so caged, this idea landed with the force of revelation. When 15-year-old Walter returned to Berlin in 1907, he came back changed. He now called himself a strict and fanatical pupil of Wyneken, and he meant every word of it. He wanted nothing less than to organize the whole German youth movement and set off an enormous spiritual revolution across the land. He began to write. Under the Latin name ardor, a word meaning passion, heat, and fire, he poured fierce, idealistic prose into underground student papers, demanding that the schools be remade from the ground up. You could see the strange intensity of him whenever he spoke in public. Walter would rise in the student debating hall before a room full of people and deliver an address that was absolutely letter-perfect, not a word out of place. He never once looked at the crowd. He fixed his eyes on a high corner of the ceiling and spoke up into it, burning with conviction, and stared at that spot the entire time. By 1913, the fire had found its fullest voice in an essay called Experience. In it, a 20-year-old Walter took aim at the adult world, arguing that older generations weaponized the concept of experience to crush the idealism of the young. For adults, gaining experience simply meant giving up. It meant trading passion for compromise, accepting a grey, mundane existence and dismissing all youthful hopes as foolish illusions. Against this cynical, beaten-down worldview, Walter urged his generation to reclaim the word. True experience, he argued, wasn't about surrendering to the daily grind at all, but about protecting your spirit and refusing to let the adult world extinguish your ideals. That October, he made his way to a gathering on the High Meißner, a tall mountain and wild stretch of country in the heart of Germany. It was a defining moment for the burgeoning German counterculture. Surrounded by thousands of rebellious students, Walter championed a radical new manifesto. The pledge they adopted was essentially a declaration of independence for their generation. It stated that from now on, the youth of Germany would no longer blindly obey their parents, their teachers, or the state. Instead, they would shape their own lives, take responsibility for their own futures, and live by their own authentic truth. But even within this rebellious movement, Walter was a massive intellectual snob. While other students were perfectly happily playing guitars and doing folk dances around a campfire, Walter was deeply annoyed. He felt these trivial Boy Scout activities were a distraction from the sacred, philosophical seriousness of their mission. He also refused to let their movement be hijacked by traditional political parties. He didn't want them chained to socialism or nationalism, but to remain completely free, a pure intellectual vanguard, united only by the raw energy of their own awakening. By the early summer of 1914, Walter had been re-elected president of the Berlin Independent Students Association. He launched lecture series, and he pressed the university to throw out vocational training entirely in favor of what he called the Tolstoyan spirit. After Leo Tolstoy's gospel of moral purity, and stern devotion to the life of the mind. His whole existence had folded itself into this sealed, utopian world of midnight argument and radical pamphlets, certain beyond doubt that his gifted generation would remake the soul of Europe by thought alone. He could not have known how thin the ground beneath him truly was. Under all that talk of spirit and destiny ran a fault, and it was about to split wide open. The trenches were waiting, and with them an unbearable test of loyalty that would tear his world to pieces, send his dearest friends to their deaths by their own hands, and deliver from the master he revered above all others a betrayal he could never forgive. Chapter 3. Friendship, Marriage, and the War. In the first days of August, Germany declared war on Russia and on France, and the whole of Berlin seemed to catch a fever. Crowds surged through the streets, flushed with a patriotism that bordered on madness. Inside the West End Café, a place the Bohemians fondly nicknamed the Café Delusions of Grandeur, Walter and his circle made a sudden, strange decision. They would enlist together. The motive had nothing to do with glory or the fatherland. They simply could not bear the thought of the draft scattering them across the country. As it happened, the army examined Walter and turned him away, his eyes far too weak for soldiering. Whatever relief he felt did not last the week. On the morning of the 9th of August, an express letter woke him, and the words inside were only a single line: "You will find us lying in the meeting house." His dearest friend, Fritz Heinle, and Heinle's girlfriend, Rika Seligson, had taken their own lives, opening the gas taps in the student discussion hall. It was a silent, total refusal of the slaughter the world had chosen. The city offered no mercy afterward. The grieving survivors were forbidden to bury the unmarried pair together, as though even death had to obey the rules of respectability. For Walter, it was a radicalizing moment. He realized that a society this heartless could not last, and he became absolutely certain that Berlin would eventually face the violent, bloody scars of a revolution. Then came a second wound, 3 months later. In November, Gustav Weineken, the radical teacher who had first lit the fire in Walter's mind, stood up in Munich and gave a speech called Youth and War. He urged the young to surrender their independence and march off to defend Germany. To Walter, this was an unparalleled disgrace, an outrage from the very man who had taught him to think for himself. He agonized for months. Finally, in the spring of 1915, he wrote a letter severing the bond entirely. "The pursuit of truth within you has been blinded," he told his old idol, "and you have sacrificed young people to the state." After that, Walter wanted no part whatsoever in the state's war, so he learned to perform. Called before the military board, he mimicked the trembling of a man afflicted with palsy and won himself a year's reprieve. Later he would sit up through a whole night with a new friend, drinking cup after cup of black coffee to send his heart racing and fail the induction exam by morning. That new friend was a fierce, brilliant teenager named Gershom Scholem, a committed Zionist, drawn to the early 20th century movement that called for the establishment of a Jewish homeland. Where Walter dwelt in abstraction, Scholem hungered for something to build in the real world. They met in the July of 1915, after a lecture, and Walter greeted the younger man with a perfect, formal bow before inviting him home to the family villa. There, in a study lined with books and paintings, the two plunged into endless arguments about history, mathematics, and the Kabbalah, the ancient tradition of Jewish mysticism. Scholem found something almost magical in his friend. When Walter spoke in public, he fixed a rigid stare on the ceiling. In private, his voice turned melodious and unforgettable. But Walter fiercely resisted Skolum's push toward political Zionism. When prominent intellectuals like Martin Buber invited Walter to write for Jewish political journals, he flatly refused, countering with a deeply mystical philosophy of language born out of the trauma of 1914. Horrified by how the state had used cheap, jingoistic propaganda to march his generation into the trenches, he insisted that writing must never be wielded as a crude tool for political action. Instead, he believed that true writing had to completely bypass the violent noise of the world. It worked its magic, he argued in a letter to Buber, only when aimed into the core of innermost silence, seeking to illuminate deep, hidden truths, rather than flattening reality into a transactional political manifesto. Amid these towering friendships, a love affair caught fire. Her name was Dora Pollard, a clever, practical, ambitious woman, and though she was already married, she began divorce proceedings to be with him. Theirs was a turbulent thing, full of shared work and sudden storms. Visiting a Bavarian villa that August, the two flaunted their devotion to the visiting Scholem, while Walter played him in painfully slow games of blindfolded chess. They married in Berlin in the April of 1917. Walter was 25 years old. To slip the draft and the smothering militarism of home, the newlyweds gathered medical certificates, helped along by Dora, hypnotizing her husband into genuine sciatica, and crossed into neutral Switzerland. They settled first in Zurich, then in Bern, and there a deep loneliness closed over them. The old community had simply vanished. Looking out at the Alps in early 1918, Walter understood that the whole world of his youth had been razed. 6 years, he wrote, lived at a monstrous tempo, holding within them an infinite amount of the past. He was stranded in a foreign land with a pregnant wife, leaning on a father who despised his choices, the student movement gone, clutching the dead friend's poems as the last warm fragment of a vanished golden world. And now, somehow, this young father would have to build a future from nothing at all. Chapter 4. The Academic Catastrophe. Out of the rubble of the First World War emerged the Weimar Republic, a democracy as fragile as it was unloved, propped up by men who scarcely believed in it and surrounded by enemies who longed to see it fall. Germany had emerged from the conflict, beaten and broke, its economy in ruins, its old certainties gone, and the young republic was bleeding from within. Just a year earlier, a leftist coalition had launched the Spartacist uprising to establish a socialist republic, a rebellion the government crushed by unleashing the Freikorps, marauding right-wing mercenaries who drowned the revolutionaries in blood. The violence only escalated from there. The right wing attempted the Kapp-Putsch to seize the capital, while communist workers seized the Ruhr in the country's west. An uprising the Freikorps ended in a slaughter of more than 3,000 dead. And it was into this wounded country that Walter, now 28 years old, found himself returning, defeated, to the grand Berlin villa of his parents. He had no real prospects. He had no career to speak of. Poverty had driven him back beneath his father's roof. The money that had once made the family comfortable was vanishing by the hour. The German mark, which had begun the decade at 14 to the dollar, would collapse to something almost beyond imagining by the close of 1923. 399 billion marks to $1 American dollar. A fortune turned to paper. His parents had grown weary of supporting a grown son with no income, and they wanted a career that paid, and they wanted it soon. They would not hand over the kind of support that might let him stand on his own. He refused to bend, and by May, The whole thing came apart in what he described as a total falling out. "Things have almost never been as miserable for me, not in my entire life," he wrote. Meanwhile, the financial situation had gone from bad to worse. By the close of 1922, the economy had tipped into pure chaos. In December of 1919, a loaf of bread cost under 3 marks. 3 years on, it had climbed to 163. By that following August, 69,000. And at the dizzy peak of the madness, a single loaf ran to 399 billion marks. "Everything here conveys a miserable impression," Walter wrote. In the middle of all this, his father made one last demand. The boy was to give up the endless life of a student and take a steady job as a clerk in a bank. There was something almost absurd in it, this dreaming philosopher slotted into the gears of a financial house. To a man whose whole life was bound up in books and ideas, the suggestion must have felt like a small death. The offer came to 8,000 marks a month, which in that ruined November amounted to roughly $1.25. Walter turned it down flat. "I am determined to put an end to my dependence on my parents, no matter what," he wrote. Their need to dominate, he said, had become a torture that devoured every ounce of energy he had for his work and all his joy in living besides. With the bank refused, one respectable door remained open to him, a single remaining path that might lead to a salary without surrendering his soul. He set his eyes on the German university and on a daunting hurdle known as the habilitation. It was a kind of second dissertation, the great qualifying work a scholar had to produce before he could teach as a professor. Pass it, and he would have a teaching post, a reliable income, and at long last, the vindication his family demanded. For Walter, it represented his one hope of solid ground, a footing on which he might support his wife, Dora, and their little boy, Stefan. For his subject, he chose something nobody else seemed to want. He would write about the German mourning play, the gloomy, violent, tragic dramas of the 17th century Baroque known as the Trauerspiel. Dismissed by traditional scholars as crude and faintly embarrassing, the material was bleak to its bones. It dwelt on an age of wreckage and endless war, a world hollowed of meaning. The Baroque, he argued, held none of the heroism of classical tragedy. What it offered instead was a kind of natural history of decay. Human actions were deprived of all value, he wrote. Something new arose, an empty world. But Walter didn't mean to dwell on the past. He wanted to use it to diagnose the present. In the ruin and brokenness of the Baroque stage, he saw a reflection of his own fractured age. He worked through 1924 in an intellectual fever, often by candlelight, when Berlin's strikes plunged the city into darkness, and the boundary between his historical research and the modern crisis began to dissolve. The religious man of the Baroque clings so tightly to the world, he wrote, because he feels himself being driven with it toward a cataract. That same cataract was roaring right outside his window. The unrest in the streets, the festering wound of his family estrangement, and the dread of academic failure pressed him down into profound despair. Adversities beset him from every side like wolves, he wrote, and he did not know how to keep them at bay. Watching the hyperinflation eat through the German economy, he sensed it eating through the human spirit, too. In their naked misery, he observed, the people cooped up in the country could no longer make out the contours of human personality. Every free man looked to them like an eccentric. Things were shedding their intrinsic character, he thought, and ambiguity was crowding out whatever was real. He had to get out. The air of Berlin had grown poisonous to him, and he set his sights on Capri, that warm Italian island far to the south. Living there was cheaper, but the journey itself cost dearly. To buy his ticket, Walter parted with pieces of the book collection he had so lovingly built. Then, in April of 1924, a headline in an evening paper stopped him cold. A ban on foreign travel. To keep money from fleeing the country, Germans would soon need to deposit an enormous sum before crossing the border, and the rule took hold in 3 days. He had no such sum. So, he flung his things together and bolted for the frontier, leaving his friends, wife, and child behind, racing toward the Mediterranean, with an impossible manuscript in his case, and no earthly idea whether it would be his salvation or his ruin. Chapter 5, Capri, Communism, and Asja. Walter had left his family far behind, but on the island he was far from alone. Capri was full of people just like him. Drifting thinkers, broke writers, an exile colony of Germans washed up on warm rock, mixing with the Italian futurists. Futurism was a wild avant-garde movement intoxicated with speed and machinery and violence, in love with everything fast and loud and modern. In the evenings, Walter would sit and listen to Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, the founder and ringleader of the whole movement, perform his strange noise poems. Marinetti would conjure the whinnying of horses and the thunder of cannons and the rattle of machine gun fire, all with his voice. And in the daytime, surrounded by this chaos, Walter tried to grind away at his dense scholarly thesis on German Baroque theatre, shut away in a tiny whitewashed laundry room that felt to him like a cave buried in grapevines and wild roses. Then, in June, everything changed. Walter spotted a woman struggling in a shop near La Piazzetta, the island's little main square. She was trying to buy almonds and didn't know the Italian word for them. He stepped forward. "May I help you, madam?" He got her the almonds, followed her out into the square. "May I accompany you and carry your packages?" he asked. Standing there and now holding her groceries, he puffed up his courage. "Allow me to introduce myself," he said. "Dr. Walter Benjamin." But his nerves immediately got the better of him. His glasses caught the light like a pair of small headlamps, his clumsy hands fumbled, and he promptly dropped all of her packages right onto the cobblestones. The woman was Asja, a Latvian Bolshevik and a director of proletarian children's theatre who had come to the island to heal her young daughter's troubled lungs. He fell in love at once, completely and hopelessly. The romance worked on him like a detonator, blowing apart his careful bourgeois routines. He wrote afterwards of the wreckage with a kind of wonder, admitting the disruption had been bad for his work, that his project had been dangerously interrupted, and describing Asja as a Russian revolutionary from Riga, one of the most splendid women I have ever met. Through her, something shifted in him. Communism stopped being a dry idea in a book and became a living, magnetic pull. Asja pushed him, challenged him directly, demanded that he stop hiding the political bones of his thinking behind layers of abstraction. He wrote a feeling of vital liberation, shot through with a sudden insight into what radical communism actually meant as a way of standing in the world rather than a theory to be argued. Around the same time he was reading Georg Lukács and found to his surprise how many points of contact there were between that Bolshevist thinking and his own mournful meditations on the 17th century. He resolved to push those discoveries further by experiment and by taking things to their extreme. His new politics, though, would never bow to Soviet orthodoxy. Walter started building something stranger, a kind of Gothic Marxism, with one foot still standing in Jewish mysticism. He had no patience for the mainstream reformist left of the day, the social democrats who believed history was a gentle staircase climbing peacefully upward toward a better world. For Walter, progress was a storm heaping wreckage on wreckage, and revolution was no inevitable law of history, but a desperate, last-ditch interruption. As he put it, twisting Marx into something new, Marx says that revolutions are the locomotive of world history. But perhaps it is quite otherwise. Perhaps revolutions are an attempt by the passengers on this train, namely the human race, to activate the emergency brake. That radical lens cracked his writing wide open. He and Asja took day trips across the bay to Naples and threw themselves into its raw, anarchic life. And together they wrote a short city portrait, simply called Naples. It pioneered a new montage-like prose, all flashing fragments instead of tidy argument. They named the city's secret porosity, the way poverty and passion dissolved every boundary. Just as the living room appears on the street, they wrote, so the street migrates into the living room. All of this was happening as fascism's shadow lengthened across Europe. That September, Mussolini himself landed on Capri, and Walter watched him coldly, stripping away the myth. He saw the forced festive decorations, the icy welcome from the locals beneath the bunting, the thousands of secret police. And he dismissed the dictator with surgical contempt, calling his body plump and unarticulated like the fist of a fat shopkeeper. He finally tore himself away from the island in October and returned to Berlin to finalize the manuscript. He spent the winter dictating the last pages, privately joking to a friend that his impossibly dense introduction was unmitigated chutzpah. But as he prepared to hand it over to the university, a profound dread coiled inside him. He was only pushing through with this academic gambit out of financial terror, desperately needing a salary to support his family. But in his heart, he had come to view the German university as a decaying, spiritually bankrupt machine. He realized that he feared actually winning the professorship almost as much as losing it. He was terrified that a dull, provincial life in a town like Frankfurt, giving mandatory lectures to students, would devour his precious time. To his newly radicalized mind, becoming a comfortable bourgeois professor felt like a trap, a soul-crushing death sentence, no better than his father's old ultimatum to become a bank clerk. Nevertheless, in early 1925, he submitted the book. The manuscript was passed to a professor named Hans Cornelius, who made an honest effort to wade through its tangled, mosaic-like prose. His verdict came swiftly, and it was merciless. He could not, he wrote, despite repeated and concentrated efforts, draw any comprehensible meaning from the work, and such an incomprehensible style could hardly guide students. On the 13th of July, the faculty met and quietly arranged for Walter to withdraw his application, sparing themselves the awkwardness of a formal rejection. The door of the academy had been slammed in his face, but thanks to Asja and the political awakening of Capri, he had already stopped believing in that world. Yes, he was now 33, officially a failure, and cast out of the respectable world forever. But he was finally free. And the pulse of that freedom, an ache for a new way of seeing for the radical left and for Asja, the woman who had blown his life apart, would soon draw him eastward, toward a frozen Russian city and the very edges of his own mind. Chapter 6. Moscow and a Mind at the Edge. The 6th of December, 1926. Walter stepped off the train into a Moscow locked in deep winter, his breath turning to frost the moment it left him. The city he found was a strange thing indeed, an improvised metropolis that seemed to have fallen into place overnight, part hospital and part fortress, all at once. He had crossed the whole of Europe in a hurry, propelled by a single piece of news. Word had reached Berlin that Asja had collapsed from a nervous disorder. So here he was. A man met him at the platform, Bernhard Reich, who happened to be Asja's romantic partner in the city. The two of them went straight to the sanatorium. And there she was, wild beneath her Russian fur hat, her face a little puffy from the long weeks spent in bed. What followed was a strange and suffocating arrangement. Reich became Walter's city guide, walking him past the Kremlin walls and introducing him to the official writers' organization, the state-run body that decided what a person could and couldn't publish in the Soviet Union. The two men were rivals for the same woman, and Asja seemed to enjoy the tension she'd created. She would offer Walter a meaningful glance, then leave him pleading for a moment alone. When he complained that a Soviet general was now pursuing her too, she only mocked him. Walter swung helplessly between love and something close to resentment. Her hardness baffled him. In secret, he scribbled a note to a former lover back in Germany, asking her to keep an evening free for his return, then begging her to tear the letter up the moment she'd read it. And then there was his wife Dora, back in Berlin, living in his parents' villa. While Walter chased a Bolshevik theatre director across the ice and lamented his poverty, it was Dora who was actually working, raising their young son Stefan and dealing with the exhausting reality of being married to a freelance genius who barely contributed a dime. All the while, Moscow was offering Walter its own sort of education. The ice on the narrow pavements was so treacherous that Walter had to learn how to walk all over again. The lights at the Kremlin gates were blinding. The guards stood wrapped in furs the color of ochre, and a red traffic signal threw its glow across the snow. Time in Moscow ran on a single elastic word, sefas, meaning at once, which in practice meant you would wait and wait and wait some more. But the deepest shock for Walter was something far stranger than ice or waiting. The private self he had always carried within him simply did not seem to exist in this place. Bolshevism had abolished private life, he wrote, and it had done so by pulling apart the very idea of the private home. The Soviets saw domestic comfort as a kind of capitalist illness, so they made people live in bare, shared rooms that felt more like public squares. To grasp why this so gripped him, you must picture the heavy, cluttered Berlin villa where his own wife still sat. Walter looked upon the bourgeois living room as a shell built around the ego, stuffed with thick velvet and dark carved sideboards and sunless corners choked with potted plants. To Walter, that padded shell was more like a coffin. Surrounded by soulless luxury and dead objects, a person became cut off from the rest of humanity, and from this loneliness, he believed, grew a deep melancholia. The bare Russian rooms told a different story. Here people lived in sparse spaces that served as office and club and street, and every week they shoved their meagre furniture into fresh arrangements so that it became quite impossible ever to grow cozy. You could not sink into a soft armchair and forget the world outside. The wall between private and public had simply dissolved. For Walter, this destruction of the cozy, private self was a necessary shock to the system. He believed that modern people were sleepwalking through their lives, and he was always chasing ways to jolt them awake, a sudden flash of clarity he called profane illumination. And there, in freezing Moscow, Walter believed he had found one more tool to deliver that very shock to the masses: the cinema. Before the movies, audiences had the theatre. In a theatre, you sat still in your seat, watching a continuous scene unfold on a stage from a safe, fixed distance. But a movie camera refused to sit still. With a sudden cut, a lens could seize a dull, everyday scene and blow it to fragments in a heartbeat. It could zoom in tight on a single teardrop, cut instantly to a roaring factory, and then throw you under the wheels of a moving train. This violent, shifting perspective shattered the safe, boring way people were used to seeing the world, letting the audience wander through the scattered ruins of an ordinary moment. To Walter, the camera was a revolutionary weapon that could physically jolt a sleeping audience awake. Yet his time among the Soviets was starting to curdle. This was the mid-20s. Lenin was dead, and a man named Joseph Stalin was ruthlessly gathering absolute power into his own hands, crushing the wild artistic freedoms that the revolution had once promised. When Walter was commissioned to write an encyclopedia entry on Goethe, the towering father of classical German literature, the editors rejected his draft as far too radical for the plain, obedient clarity the new regime demanded. And so he filled his diary with agonized debate over whether to join the German Communist Party, which in those years meant binding oneself wholly to Moscow and surrendering one's independence of mind. Membership would give his writing a solid framework, a mandate. But to become a communist, he realized, meant completely giving up your private independence, and the price was simply too steep. As long as I continue to travel, he concluded, joining the party is obviously something fairly inconceivable. He remained an outsider, with no party and no profession. By the 1st of February, 1927, it was over. The love affair stayed a painful knot. His political hopes lay dashed, and Walter boarded the train out of Moscow, exhausted and uncertain, his mind permanently rewired, pushed to an edge from which it would never quite return. Ahead lay a transformed Germany, and the one path still open to him to take these raw and fractured visions and remake himself in the roaring print culture of Weimar into the most dangerous freelance critic in all of Europe. Chapter 7. Becoming the Critic. Berlin in the late 1920s was known as the most important newspaper city in the entire world, with more than 2,000 periodicals spilling onto the newsstands every single month. The middle classes had money to spend again, and they spent some of it on words. Walter saw his chance. He set down the dense, suffocating prose of those failed academic manuscripts and took up something lighter, nimbler, sharper, the feuilleton, they called it. In the European papers, the feuilleton was the cultural section printed below the line of the daily news, and it carried real weight. Imagine the most thoughtful arts and philosophy writing a newspaper could offer, treated with the seriousness others gave to politics or finance. That was where he made his home. A fierce energy seized him. He became a regular at the Frankfurter Zeitung, a paper that held the cultural standing of something like the New York Times or the New Yorker for a German readership. The critic is the strategist in the literary struggle, he announced, and he meant it. He invented a little form all his own, the Denkbild, the thinking image, a tight vignette where some piece of philosophy was strained through the rubbish of ordinary city life. He wrote on the strangest things: children's toys, food exhibitions, the loops and slants of someone's handwriting, the fog of hashish, the forgotten love affairs of 19th century chambermaids. He even wrote about postage stamps, claiming they bristled with tiny numbers and minute letters, living on like lower animals even when mutilated. To know the truth of an age, he believed, you had to look at its most ridiculed and discarded things. To win himself a place among the French, Walter took on a punishing job. He set about co-translating Marcel Proust's vast novel In Search of Lost Time, which stands among the longest and most intricately layered books ever written, its sentences winding on like rivers that forget where they began. The labor wore him down to the bone. He admitted it made him physically sick, confessing that working so closely with a writer chasing the very goals he chased himself brought on something like the symptoms of intestinal poisoning. Yet the translation, published in 1927, brought him real acclaim. He became the great bridge between the French avant-garde and the German public, wandering into the dreamlike poetry of the surrealists, those 1920s artists obsessed with dreams and the bizarre workings of the unconscious mind. Their mysticism, in the end, he set aside, preferring what he continued calling a profane illumination, rooted in the solid stuff of daily life. He chased this illumination not just on the printed page, but in his own bloodstream. To figure out how the mind could be shocked awake, Walter set about dissolving the boundaries of his own perception. Under the gentle watch of two doctor friends, he began swallowing hashish, which he cheerfully named his poison. He took it to take his mind apart, piece by careful piece. He kept notes throughout, recording how the drug peeled away his numb, grown-up filter until ordinary things turned strange and magical. Solid objects seemed to wear masks within masks. Space folded over on itself like the overlapping pages of a cheap paperback. He followed the same paths of thought as ever. He marveled. Only now they appeared strewn with roses. This dizzying intellectual climb came alongside a collapse in his private world. In 1929, the delicate truce of his open marriage came apart. Asja had actually arrived in Berlin late the previous year to work at the Soviet embassy. For 2 turbulent months, Walter and Asja even lived together, though her feelings for him remained as cold and unpredictable as ever. When her German residency permit neared expiration, Walter made a desperate, high-stakes gamble to keep her. Hoping to marry her and secure her citizenship, he demanded a divorce from Dora. The court fight turned vicious. Dora, drained by his money troubles and his long absences, poured her heart into a bitter letter. All he was now, she wrote, was brains and sex, with everything else having ceased to function. And in such cases, she warned, it would not be long before the brains themselves abdicated. The judge ruled against him hard. To pay back a crushing 40,000-marked debt to Dora, Walter sold the thing he loved most, his lovingly gathered collection of rare children's books. He ended up without property or position, home or funds, living in a borrowed room, writing flat on his back on a sofa that had once belonged to a paralyzed woman. In the middle of all this wreckage, a friendship arrived that reshaped his mind. In May of that year, Walter met Bertolt Brecht, the cigar-chewing Marxist playwright and theatre director whose work would echo through the century. Brecht brought an elemental force into his life, dragging his refined, esoteric Marxism down towards something rougher and more direct. They sat up through long nights, arguing over books and politics and film. They decided together that Charlie Chaplin's slapstick, where laughter hovered over an abyss of horror, was the secret key to understanding the strange fictions of Franz Kafka. Brecht's blunt practicality left its mark, though it could turn chilling. During one argument about gathering the working class together, Brecht remarked offhandedly that you would have to kill 200,000 Berliners simply to draw 50,000 genuine proletarians into one place. Hungry for income, Walter reached for the newest medium of all. Between 1929 and 1932, this obscure theorist stepped before the microphone more than 80 times for radio stations in Berlin and Frankfurt. He never treated this new technology as a pulpit for lecturing the masses. It was, to him, a deeply democratic instrument. The spirit of radio, he said, was to put as many people as possible in front of a microphone on every possible occasion. He mocked the establishment's patronizing model of the offering, a one-way broadcast where isolated experts spoon-fed high culture down to a passive, silent public. He understood the medium's brutal intimacy instead. No reader ever shut a book, they'd only just opened the way. A listener, after a minute and a half of dull chatter, would reach over and switch off the radio. Those who tuned into the Berlin Youth Program found no gloomy philosopher waiting for them. They found a warm and endlessly curious storyteller, spinning broadcasts about witch trials, and bootleggers and earthquakes, holding children and young adults spellbound. Walter pushed at the edges of sound itself, with experimental plays like The Brouhaha Around Little Casper. Casper, the chaotic, anarchic folk puppet, much like the German cousin of Punch and Judy, gets hauled off the street into a radio studio, panics at the microphone, and erupts into a foul-mouthed rant. He flees, gets sent to bed, and only then learns the station has bugged his mattress, broadcasting his morning grumbles live to the nation. It was a sly attack on the selling off of culture and the invasion of private life, all dressed up as a noisy bit of slapstick. But beyond the studio doors, the Republic was bleeding to death. After the crash of 1929, the German economy shattered, and by March of 1930, 3 million men stood idle in the streets. Walter wrote that the country's order had grown as stable as the high seas, its emergency decrees colliding like the crests of waves. He watched the National Socialists move in to weaponize the desperate. And he fought back on the page, firing scathing reviews at nationalist authors like Ernst Junger, unmasking their mystical hunger for war. That autumn, fully aware of the danger, Walter even walked into a meeting of the Strasser SA Group, a violent, anti-capitalist paramilitary faction of the Nazi Party, and sat among the brown shirts, a Jewish Marxist, quietly taking mental notes as he listened to their debates, finding the spectacle, as he put it, in part fascinating. By 1931, the transformation was finished. The academic failure had become the most dangerous and insightful critic in all of Weimar Germany. For all the grind of freelance hustle and the thickening violence in the streets, Walter had clawed his way to the very heart of Europe's most thrilling culture. Lying on that rented sofa, ringed by his remaining 2,000 books, he wrote to a friend with a deep and hard-won contentment. He felt, he said, like an adult for the first time in his life, grown up, at last, at the age of 39, having almost realized one of the many ways of living that had always lived inside him. Yet all this stability rested on ground that was splitting beneath him. The same unruly democracy that let a radical Jewish thinker broadcast communist-tinged fairy tales was being torn apart, piece by piece. Emergency decrees piled up. Unemployment swelled the street militias. By the summer of 1932, the radio work dried up as right-wing officials seized the airwaves, and the newspapers stopped answering his letters. The glittering experiment of Weimar Berlin was sliding into its final hours, and the great catastrophe, the rise of Hitler and his party, waited only months away, ready to scatter this whole bright circle of thinkers across the earth or into the grave. Chapter 8. 1933 and Exile. The 30th of January began like any winter morning in Berlin, with frost on the windows and newspaper boys calling out the headlines. By evening, everything had changed. Paul von Hindenburg, the aging president of Germany, had handed the office of Chancellor to Adolf Hitler. An old soldier signed a document, and the country tipped over the edge. For Walter, the ground beneath his whole existence began to give way. Not long after came the night of the 27th of February. The Reichstag, the great German parliament building, caught fire and burned through the dark hours until dawn. The Nazis seized upon the flames as a pretext, a false alarm raised on purpose, and within hours emergency powers were decreed. Civil liberties vanished. A police state hardened around the population overnight. The Berlin that had glittered with cabarets and electric tram lines and arguments over coffee became, almost at once, a trap with the door swinging shut. Opposition parties were outlawed. People who spoke against the regime were hunted down and murdered. Writers and poets and actors simply disappeared from the streets where they had once been familiar faces. Bertolt Brecht fled. So did Ernst Bloch and Siegfried Kracauer, both of them prominent German Jewish thinkers of the left, anti-fascists who understood precisely what was coming for them. Friends Walter had known for years were dragged into camps thrown up in haste. He barely dared to leave his rooms. He wrote that the small composure his circle had managed in the face of the new regime was rapidly spent, that the air was hardly fit to breathe anymore, a condition that lost its meaning as one was being strangled. And this, he added, above all, economically. There were places where he could earn a minimal income, he observed, and places where he could live on one, but not a single place where the two ever met. By spring, the terror had grown teeth. People were hauled from their beds in the dead of night, tortured and killed. The radio belonged entirely to the Nazis now, and boycotts of Jewish shops were already being planned. Every manner of expression that failed to conform was terrorized, Walter wrote, and he described an atmosphere where you looked first at a stranger's lapel for the party badge, and afterwards no longer wished to meet his eyes. He noticed something eerie in how every office returned his manuscripts at almost the same moment, broke off negotiations, left his letters unanswered, as if by some silent arrangement. On the evening of the 17th of March, ahead of the first laws barring Jews from public life, he boarded a train bound for France. He crossed out of his homeland without incident, never to return. He reached Paris 2 days later and took a room at the Hotel Istria in Montparnasse, the bohemian quarter where artists and exiles and penniless writers had long gathered. He sat on the terrace, smoking his pipe, shaking his head over the newspapers. Others told themselves the Nazis would pass like bad weather. Walter knew better. His life had been cut clean in two, and the comfortable world of his childhood was finished. He sublet his Berlin flat. He begged his former wife, Dora, to send their teenage son Stefan to Palestine, which in those years before Israel was a refuge for Jews fleeing the violence of Europe, but she would not be parted from the boy. Dreading the cost of Paris, he sailed in April to the Spanish island of Ibiza, hunting for somewhere he might survive on 60 or 70 marks a month. Ibiza had changed. San Antonio rang with construction and German tourists, some of them Nazis. Each morning, Walter carried a deck chair and a thermos to a hidden spot on a hillside to read Lucretius, the ancient Roman poet and philosopher. He took a room with walls like paper, sharing it with what he counted as 300 flies. To save money, he later moved into a windowless room with no plumbing, inside an active building site, paying nothing at all. Hunger gave him a savage inflammation in his leg, and he lay stranded on what he called the worst mattress in the world. In a piece he titled Sad Poem, he set down the creeping despair, the chair, the writing, growing more and more tired, going to bed at the right time, eating at the right time. Having money given by the good Lord, life is wonderful. The heart beating louder and louder, the sea growing stiller and stiller, right down to its ground. Word reached him that his brother, Georg, a communist councillor, had been seized by Nazi stormtroopers, beaten and flung into a cell. Spies were everywhere. He wrote to Dora using her middle name as a code. To dull the dread, he tried opium with his friend Jean Sells, a French writer, the two of them taking turns to mind one another through the long nights. He studied the curtains and called them interpreters of the language of the wind. He found brief comfort in a love affair with a Dutch painter, Anna Maria Blaupoort ten Cate, writing to her that in her arms fate would forever cease to accost him, that it could no longer catch him unawares with fear or happiness. When his passport neared its expiry that July, he sailed to Majorca and reported it lost, fearing the consulate might seize it. He got a replacement, but by October, malaria drove him back to Paris, and the full weight of being stateless. The German exiles in the city drew together in the cafes, a tight and anxious circle. It was here that Hannah Arendt, a brilliant young Jewish political philosopher who would one day become famous the world over, grew into a vital presence in Walter's daily life. They shared the shock of statelessness and the weight of their heritage, talking over cheap coffee and cigarette smoke. Around them moved the others, Krakauer, the writer Arthur Koestler, and Brecht, a community of ghosts waiting for visas and trading rumours about who had been arrested back home. And as they sat there, watching the regime bend the radio and the cinema to its will, mesmerising a whole nation, the talk began to turn from mere survival towards something stranger and darker. Walter started to see that the new powers of photography and film were reshaping how authority itself took hold of the masses, and the thought drove him toward a desperate piece of writing, one that would try to make sense of where art, technology, and violence had begun to meet. Chapter 9. The Work of Art. After years of drifting across Paris through cheap, unheated hotels, Walter finally found a small measure of stability in the autumn of 1935, taking a tiny seventh-floor sublet on the Rue Bernard. But a roof over his head did not mean safety. He was still desperately poor, living on a lifeline stipend that covered barely 2 weeks of every month. He built his days around the reading rooms of the French National Library. He would arrive when the doors opened and stay until they locked at 6 in the evening. In a letter, he mentioned almost in passing that he ought to renew his identity card, but lacked the 100 francs it required. That was the texture of his life. Out of this precarious isolation came one of the most startling diagnoses of the modern visual world ever written. He hammered the essay out across the darkest months of the year, treating it as a weapon. In this work, he wrote, he found the main reason not to lose courage in the struggle for existence. Walter wrote with the frantic energy of a man watching his continent slide toward catastrophe. He wanted a materialist theory of art. Materialist, in this sense, doesn't mean a love of shopping or shiny things, but a way of looking at art through the hard facts of money, labour, physical conditions, and class. Real material conditions. His claim was bold. The way human beings perceive the world, he argued, shifts as their whole way of living shifts. Even our senses have a history. If the tools we use to see the world change, like the invention of the camera, the way our brains process reality changes right along with them. To prove this, Walter pointed to a massive, invisible earthquake happening in modern perception, the destruction of the aura. For thousands of years, he said, a work of art had a singular presence, an aura. It existed here and nowhere else, rooted in one specific place and moment. Think of an elk painted deep inside a cave, somewhere almost no one could reach, or a Madonna shut away in a secluded chapel. Their power came from their scarcity. To see them, you had to travel. You came to the object on its terms, in its place, in its presence. That uniqueness was tied entirely to ritual. Originally, an artwork wasn't made just to be looked at, but to be used in a magical or religious ceremony. A wooden statue of a saint that we might today see as a beautiful carving was more of a sacred object to the people who made it. It might be kept hidden in a dark church alcove, revealed only on specific holy days, and prayed to in silence. Its power came from its mystery, its distance, and the fact that you had to treat it with reverence. Then mechanical reproduction shattered all of that. The Greeks could stamp coins and little figures of terracotta and little else. But woodcuts arrived, then lithography, an old method of mass printing from stone or metal plates, and finally the lightning speed of photography, film, and industrialized mass media. Even the most perfect copy of an artwork, he wrote, lacks one thing: its presence in time and space, its unique existence in the spot where it happens to be. Suddenly, a photograph of a cathedral could sit in your palm. A print of a Rembrandt could be pinned above a bed. The sacred distance simply collapsed. The artwork was torn from its shell. And Walter did not weep over this. He welcomed it as a clearing away of an old elitism, a sense that all things were now equal and within reach. Because of this, art's entire purpose shifted. It moved away from the value of being worshipped in secret to what he called exhibition value, the value of being widely seen by the public. Instead of a unique painting hidden in a private palace, you now had a film reel that could be shipped in metal cans to 50 different cinemas on the same night, designed specifically to be shown to thousands of ordinary people at once. The artwork stopped being a sacred relic and became a mass-shared experience. The camera changed the bond between the performer and the watcher too. On a stage, an actor offers themselves to a living audience, present, whole, wrapped in their own aura. On a film set, the actor performs for a machine. The work is chopped into takes, stripped of any natural flow, and handed to an editor to assemble. The film actor is exiled from their own body, their performance shipped out to 1,000 screens at once. The painter, Walter said, was like a healer who lays on hands, keeping a respectful distance. The cameraman was a surgeon, cutting straight into the patient, plunging deep into the tissue of reality. That mechanical penetration trained the masses in a new way of receiving art: distraction. The old bourgeois ideal was to stand alone before a canvas and sink into it. Film broke that absorption apart. You cannot freeze the moving image. No sooner has your eye caught one scene than it is cut to the next. It lands like a physical shock, echoing the jangling rush of the modern city and the grind of the assembly line. The Dadaists, a baffling avant-garde movement that flung nonsense and chaos at society to jolt it awake, had tried to make poetry hit you like a bullet. Film did it effortlessly. You could see this fragmented world reflected in figures like Charlie Chaplin and Mickey Mouse, their jerky, mechanical motions chopping human movement into hacked-up little impulses. The collective laughter of the cinema worked as a great release for people worn down by mechanized labor. The crowd absorbed it all through habit, half attentive, the way you learn the streets of a city without thinking. The public, Walter wrote, is an examiner, but an absent-minded one. Stripped of all, the audience grew testing and critical, sharing the camera's own roving eye. Once art was cut loose from ancient ritual, Walter realized it could serve something else entirely: politics. Mass media held the power to wake people up, but that hope ran straight into the grim reality of the 30s, as the machinery of reproduction was seized first by capitalism and then by fascist dictators. Capitalism used the film industry to distract. Because the camera stripped away an actor's real human presence, Hollywood manufactured a false aura to replace it, the cult of the movie star, swapping sacred awe for celebrity glamour and turning living people into sellable goods. Looking across the border from his borrowed Paris room, Walter watched this happen in real time. He saw how the Nazis had grasped this same machinery and were delivering total psychological control. He watched them master the radio, the edited newsreel, and the staged rally. They gathered crowds of furious, impoverished people who longed for change, then refused to touch the structures that kept them poor. In place of power or wages, fascism offered a show, with uniforms and flags and an enemy, letting the masses feel mighty and vent their rage while denying them any real political rights. At the floodlit Nuremberg rallies, filmed so adoringly by propagandists like Leni Riefenstahl, Walter noted how each citizen shrank into a powerless speck inside a vast geometric formation of hundreds of thousands of people. Yet, watching the newsreels afterward in the cinema, those same crowds saw themselves as part of a glorious, unstoppable machine. They were gazing at a portrait of their own subjugation and being tricked into calling it triumph. When politics stops being about who eats, who has shelter, and who owns the wealth, and becomes only feeling and image, it demands a finale. Parades cannot satisfy forever. The end point, Walter warned, was destruction, with war as the ultimate spectacle. War was the one event capable of marshalling millions of people and all of society's technology into a single unifying frenzy without ever threatening the fortunes of the ruling class. This was his famous final warning, written as he watched Europe arm itself, that fascism is the aestheticization of politics, turning public life into an emotional film that ends in slaughter. Against it, he wrote, Communism must reply by politicizing art, tearing away the illusion and using media to make people sharply aware of their own reality. With the inner workings of the modern spectacle exposed, the thin stability of his Paris exile began to crack. The warnings he had scratched out in those freezing rooms were about to turn into hard, physical fact. The freedom to sit and study old arcades in the National Library would vanish the moment the French state looked again at its German Jewish refugees and saw, instead of scholars, enemy aliens. And the barbed wire of the internment camp drew closer. Chapter 10. The Walls Close In. In September of 1939, the German army crossed into Poland, and the world tipped over the edge it had been leaning toward for years. In the towns and suburbs around Paris, fresh placards went up on walls and lampposts, instructing every German and Austrian man to present himself at the Stade Olympique in Colombes, a great stadium in one of the city's outer districts. Each man was told to bring a single blanket and nothing more. And so a bitter joke played itself out in the streets, the sort of joke that history seems unable to resist. A Jewish thinker who had fled the Nazis years before now found himself rounded up by the French Republic, the very nation that had given him shelter and held as an enemy alien. Walter was kept in the stands of the stadium for 10 long days. The food was poor, mostly cheap liver pâté smeared across bread, and the men were made to dig and fashion their own crude latrines. After that, under the watchful eyes of armed guards, he was carried off to a camp deep in the heart of the French countryside, far from anything he knew. From the train station, the prisoners faced a brutal 2-hour march on foot. For a 47-year-old, chain-smoking intellectual who had spent his entire life hunched over library desks, the sudden physical strain was devastating. His chest tightened and his breath simply gave out. Somewhere along that road, Walter sank to the ground, unable to continue, and was rescued only when a younger internee took up his small bundle of belongings and helped carry him onward. 300 men slept on the bare floor of that place until, at last, someone delivered straw. Walter built himself a small shelter beneath a winding stairway, draping a length of burlap to carve out a thin slice of privacy for himself. He could do almost nothing with his own hands. The practical world defeated him at every turn, and yet the younger men around him came to look upon him as something rare, a kind of seer in their midst, regarding him, as one account put it, with an almost biblical respect for the spiritual in a time of plagues and dangers. The hours in the camp stretched out, endless and grey, and Walter fought the dullness the only way he knew how. He set up seminars in advanced philosophy for the other prisoners, charging a modest fee paid in the strange money of the place, in cigarettes and nails and buttons. He tried to start a little journal among the men. He wrote his letters in French, hoping to ease the burden on the camp's censor. Beyond the walls, his sister and a web of fellow writers worked frantically for his freedom, among them the International Pen Club, a worldwide fellowship of authors devoted to intellectual liberty and the defense of human rights. By the middle of November, their efforts bore fruit, and Walter was released. He came home to a cold apartment in Paris, loud and without heat, and to a body that had given out beneath him. The doctors found a racing heart, dangerously high blood pressure, and an organ swollen beyond its proper size. He passed most of his days lying down. When he had to walk the streets, he was forced to stop halfway and stand still. He bought himself a gas mask and hung it in his room, where it watched over him like, in his own words, a disturbing double of those skulls with which studious monks decorated their cells. With his body failing and the continent collapsing, Walter was left alone to process a devastating betrayal. For years, people who opposed fascism had placed their ultimate hope in the Soviet Union, believing it was the one force strong enough to stop Hitler. But the Soviets had just signed a peace treaty with the Nazis, shaking hands with the very monster they were supposed to destroy. To Walter, this exposed a fatal illusion that had poisoned his allies, a blind faith in progress. And so, in the early months of 1940, alone and waiting on a desperate application for an American visa, he poured 20 years of thinking into a piece of writing that would shatter this illusion. He called it On the Concept of History. He began his essay with the story of a famous 18th century parlor trick, a fake chess-playing machine. A puppet wearing Turkish attire and with a hookah in its mouth sat before a chessboard, he wrote. To the audience, it looked like a marvel of pure clockwork that could automatically defeat any human opponent. But the machine was a hoax. The truth of it was that a hunchbacked dwarf, a master at chess, sat inside and guided the puppet's hand by means of strings. Walter used this illusion to explain exactly why his allies were losing to fascism. The mechanical puppet, he said, was the familiar Marxist theory that history operated like a machine, automatically ticking toward a better future. But on its own, this scientific worldview was just a lifeless doll. It made people passive, waiting for the gears to turn. If it actually wanted to win the game of history, the puppet needed the dwarf. It had to hide within itself the fire of theology, not organized religion, but a fierce, moral, almost mystical urgency that refused to just wait for history to happen, demanding action right now to stop the catastrophe. Without that inner fire, his leftist allies in Germany had sleepwalked into disaster. Surrendering to the myth of endless progress, they believed humanity was riding an upward escalator that no dictator could permanently stop. Nothing has so corrupted the German working class, he wrote, as the notion that it was moving with the current. Trusting this current, they treated Hitler's rise as a freak accident, a temporary glitch that the forward march of time would naturally correct. But Walter warned that this blind faith was lethal. The factories and technologies of the 20th century were now building slaughterhouses, not carrying them towards freedom. The tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception but the rule, he wrote. Fascism wasn't a passing interruption of a civilized era, but the modern world working exactly as it was built to. At the center of the essay sat a small painting by Paul Klee, the Swiss-German artist, a work called Angelus Novus that Walter had carried from one rented room to the next for 20 years. It shows an angel who seems about to move away from something he stares at. He wrote, "This is how the angel of history must look. His face is turned toward the past. Where the rest of us see a chain of separate events, the angel sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage. The angel longs to stop, to wake the dead and mend what has been broken, but a storm is blowing from paradise and has caught in his wings and will not let them close. This storm drives him irresistibly into the future, to which his back is turned," Walter wrote. What we call progress is this storm. Walter had no wish to publish these strange and burning pages, fearing they would only throw wide open the doors to enthusiastic incomprehension. Instead, he placed them in the hands of his friend Hannah Arendt for safekeeping. And then, in May of 1940, the German army tore through the French defences, and the invasion began in earnest. The complete uncertainty about what the next day, even the next hour, may bring has dominated my life for weeks now, he wrote. As the Nazi forces pressed toward Paris that June, Walter swiftly emptied his apartment, dividing up his life's work. The vast, unfinished Arcades project he entrusted to his friend Georges Bataille, the French writer, who smuggled the manuscripts into the French National Library and buried them in its sealed archives to outlast the war. And so, carrying only his gas mask, a few small things to wash with, and a single book, the memoirs of a French clergyman from 3 centuries before, Walter boarded one of the last trains out of Paris alongside his sister. The continent was closing around him like a trap drawn slowly shut. Worn down to almost nothing, without a country and running short of time, he was carried southward toward a lonely crossing, high in the Pyrenees, the mountains standing between France and Spain. Holding fast to a black leather briefcase, he swore mattered far more than his own life. Chapter 11. The Briefcase and the Border. Walter stepped off at Lourdes, a small French town nestled in the foothills of the Pyrenees Mountains. While the Nazi military hadn't physically reached Lourdes, the danger was already there. The Nazis had marched into Paris, and France had been split in two, with this southern zone now controlled by the newly formed Vichy government, a collaborationist regime that had agreed to hand over foreign refugees to the Nazi secret police upon request. Walter was now a stateless Jewish exile trapped in a hostile country. He went into hiding in a cheap room in a town swollen and choking with refugees who had nowhere left to go. His heart, already failing, grew worse in the crush of it all. Knowing he had to escape Europe entirely, Walter wrote to his close friend Theodore Adorno about the terror of not knowing what the next hour might bring. He read every newspaper as though it carried a summons meant only for him, and heard in every broadcast the voice of some fate closing in. By the middle of August, something close to a miracle arrived. Word reached him that a non-quota visa for the United States had been approved, a rare emergency document that slipped past the brutal numerical limits America had fixed on those fleeing for their lives. But there was a catch. Even though Lourdes was physically right next to the Spanish border, Walter couldn't just cross. The physical paperwork was waiting for him at the American consulate in Marseille, hundreds of miles to the east. Marseille was the diplomatic hub of the unoccupied zone, the place where all the foreign consulates were clustered. So he travelled there, arriving in a port city packed so tightly with the desperate that the air seemed thick with their waiting. At the consulates in Marseille, he successfully collected his entry visa for America and secured transit papers for Spain and Portugal. His plan was to cross the Pyrenees into Spain, travel to Lisbon, and catch a ship across the Atlantic. But here, The bureaucratic trap shut around him completely. To legally use all those hard-won visas, he needed one final document: permission to leave. The Vichy regime, doing the bidding of the Nazis and hunting Jewish refugees through its own streets, refused to issue him a French exit visa. The weeks stuck in Marseille became, as Walter described it, a terrible test of nerves. Weighed down by a profound depression, he was acutely aware of what falling into German hands would mean. It was during these suffocating days that he crossed paths with the writer Arthur Koestler, a fellow exile navigating the same desperate labyrinth. In a quiet moment between the two friends, facing the very real prospect of capture, Walter confided a dark, private safeguard he had kept hidden for years. He showed Koestler a small supply of morphine pills, enough, Koestler later recalled, to kill a horse. Walter explained that he had carried this means of escape on his person ever since the burning of the Reichstag in 1933. It wasn't an act of sudden despair, but an insurance policy he had held on to for 7 years, a way to ensure that if the door finally closed, the Nazis would not be the ones to decide his fate. Even then, the old obsessions broke through the dread. Sitting down to lunch with Soma Morgenstern, another Jewish novelist scattered by the war, Walter went strange and intent over the menu, peering through his thick glasses at his companion as if waiting for something. Morgenstern remembered the insistent looks, the sense that some remark was owed and overdue. Finally, Walter asked whether he had noticed the name of the restaurant. The innkeeper was called Arnoux. Didn't that mean anything? Madame Arnoux, he pressed, was the great unrequited love of Frédéric in Flaubert's Sentimental Education, that 19th-century novel of longing for a woman forever out of reach. Only after the soup did Walter forgive his friend's failure to remember, and he spent the rest of the meal turning over Flaubert. In late September, with every legal road exhausted, Walter travelled to Port Vendrez to meet Lisa Fitko, a guide who knew an illegal smuggler's path over the Pyrenees into Spain. The ordinary crossing at Cerbère swarmed with Vichy police, so the refugees were pushed onto the route lister, a secret and punishing mountain track named for a general and walked by anti-fascist fighters during the Spanish Civil War. Fitko looked at this broken, sweating man with his ruined heart and asked whether he truly meant to attempt it. He answered without hesitation. The real risk, he said, would be not to go. The reconnaissance climb began, and the agony came at once. To nurse his heart, Walter built himself a rigid little machine of timing. 10 minutes of slow walking, then exactly 1 minute lying flat on the ground. Through all of it, he refused to let anyone touch his heavy black leather briefcase. He clutched it close and told Fitko it held a new manuscript that mattered above everything. When they begged him to hand it over so he could breathe, he would not. The thing inside, he said, was more important than he was. Reaching a high clearing, he understood he hadn't the strength to walk back down and climb again the next day. So he announced he would sleep there alone, out on the cold mountain dirt, while the others returned to the inn below. The next morning they rejoined him for the steepest part, the climb over the spur of the mountain. His heart heaved and faltered. Fitko and the boy half dragged him up through a rocky vineyard by his arms. Pausing for a meagre bite, Walter turned and asked, with perfect courtesy, whether he might have a tomato. "With your kind permission," he said. Hours on, under a heavy heat, the terrain finally levelled out, and they came down into the coastal town of Portbou. They had done it. They were standing on Spanish soil. Having survived the impossible crossing, they made their way to the small Spanish customs office. Exhausted but believing they were finally safe, they handed over their hard-won visas, expecting nothing more than a routine transit stamp. Instead, the police delivered a devastating blow. With no prior warning, the Spanish government had changed its policies that very day, closing the border to all stateless refugees coming from France. Their visas were rejected. They were ordered to stay under guard at the Hotel Fonda de Francia to be handed back to the Vichy police and almost certainly the Nazi secret police in the morning. Inside the hotel, another refugee, Karina Birman, heard a loud rattling through the wall. She went in to find Walter half undressed on the bed, his physical reserves entirely spent. A large golden grandfather watch lay open on a board beside him, and he checked it again and again as the hours slipped away. When Birman tried to gently tell him that they had no choice but to comply and leave in the morning, Walter answered with quiet, absolute resolve. He told her there was still one alternative left to him. He would not allow himself to be marched back to the border. Deep in the night of September the 26th, the final calculation was made. He was 48 years old. He possessed one of the most brilliant, penetrating minds of the 20th century. Yet he had spent his life pursued by bad luck, poverty, and the relentless machinery of fascism. Now, physically broken and cornered in a shabby hotel room by the forces of history he had spent his life analyzing, the trap had finally closed. Walter swallowed the great dose of morphine he had kept waiting for 7 years. Before consciousness left him, he wrote a last message for Henny Gerland, a fellow refugee, to carry on. "In a situation with no way out," he wrote, "I have no other choice but to make an end of it. It is in a small village in the Pyrenees, where no one knows me, that my life will come to a close." He asked her to give his thoughts to Adorno and to explain the corner he was in, for there was no time left to write the letters he still wished to write. Early the next morning, Gerland was called to the room. Walter was dying. He asked her to tell the authorities it was illness, pressed the note into her hands, and slipped away. The doctor came too late. The death certificate, filled in by a compliant local physician to keep the body from deportation, blamed a cerebral hemorrhage. And then came the cruelest turn of all. The very next morning the border restrictions lifted. His companions were waved across into Spain and boarded their trains for Lisbon, the great port of neutral Portugal, where the fortunate found ships bound for America. Before she fled, Gerland honoured his last wishes and burned several papers to keep them from fascist hands. The municipal clerk logged what the dead man had owned: a watch, a pipe, 6 photographs, an X-ray, his glasses, a few letters, some newspapers, a little money, and a leather case. The briefcase was there in the inventory. The manuscript he had hauled over the mountains was gone, swallowed whole in the administrative chaos of that border term, leaving an aching void where his final thoughts should have been. And yet the black briefcase was only one of 2. While that case dissolved into the paperwork of a fascist outpost, another last manuscript was at that moment being carried across the very same border, entrusted weeks earlier to a friend back in Paris. Those few fragile typewritten pages would set in motion the labour of rescue that ran on for decades, lifting Walter out of obscurity, out of the anonymous casualty lists of 1940, and turning him by slow degrees into the thinker who would come to define how we understand the modern world. Chapter 12. Rescued from Oblivion. On the 28th of September, 1940, a small Catholic ceremony was held in the border town of Portbou. The records named the dead man Dr. Benjamin Walter. The hotel keeper claimed his fees for 4 nights, along with 5 lemonades, 4 telephone calls, and the cost of his medicines. The doctor took a share. So did the coffin maker, the priest, and the local judge. The last of Walter's dollars went to rent a burial niche for 5 years, and when that lease ran out, his remains were lifted from it and tipped into a collective grave so that nothing of the man remained in any marked spot at all. And so the question hung in the air: what becomes of a man's life work when the man himself has been erased from the earth? The papers he abandoned in his cramped, underheated flat on the Rue d'Ambasel in Paris were seized by the Gestapo. Some of them disappeared without trace during the war. The rest were later taken by the Red Army, hauled eastward into the Soviet Union, and turned up, eventually, in East Berlin. A second bundle had been left with friends. Part of it reached Zurich, where his sister Dora kept it for a time before sending it across the ocean to Adorno in New York. Walter had always lived through his connections, scattering his writings among a circle of trusted hands, and now those hands were flung apart across continents, locked away, or in the ground. But the most precious material had been saved by a single desperate gesture made before he ever left Paris. The heart of his arcades research, a reworking of his childhood memoirs from 1938, the latest version of his essay on mechanical reproduction, some sonnets, his notes on Brecht, and a handful of letters he considered vital were all handed to the writer Georges Bataille. Bataille passed the bulk of it to 2 librarians at the French National Library, who tucked it deep among the towering stacks. There the documents waited in darkness while the occupation pressed down on the streets above. From his internment camp, Walter had once written something that reads now like a prayer for those buried pages. "Every line we succeed in publishing today," he said, "no matter how uncertain the future to which we entrust it, is a victory wrested from the powers of darkness." One piece, though, survived only because someone physically carried it out. Hannah Arendt, herself fleeing the same shutting borders, had a typescript of his final work, the Theses on the Concept of History. She crossed that very stretch of the Pyrenees at Portbou, the same ground where Walter had died only months before, and where he had failed she made it through, carrying his thoughts safely to New York. He had described the Theses with almost shy affection, as little more than a bouquet of whispering grasses gathered on reflective walks. For years, almost nobody read any of it. In 1942, the Institute for Social Research put out a roughly copied volume called Walter Benjamin in Memoriam, holding the theses alongside essays by his friends, and it reached only a tiny handful of people. In 1947, Pierre Missac, a French critic and friend, translated the theses for the renowned journal Modern Times, and not a soul responded. When they appeared in German in the literary magazine Neue Rundschau 3 years later, the silence was just as total. The world after the war seemed to have no use for the broken-up thinking of a dead exile. The turn took decades of stubborn effort. Adorno kept pushing the great German publishing house Suhrkamp until, in 1955, a proper 2-volume edition appeared and a real rediscovery began. Volumes of essays and letters followed through the 1960s. Arendt, meanwhile, fought through tangled questions of rights, complicated by the death of Walter's brother in the Mauthausen camp, until her English edition, Illuminations, landed in 1969 and threw his ideas wide open to the English-speaking world. By then, the forgotten critic had been reborn as something nobody quite expected, a political firebrand. West German students passed his work hand to hand in pirated copies, picturing him with a photocopier in one fist and a joint in the other, reading him as a guide to seizing the machinery of media. Some militants, among them Andreas Baader of the far-left militant group known as the Red Army Faction, reached for his thoughts on historical violence. Fierce fights broke out over what he had truly meant, with critics in magazines like Merkur and Alternative accusing Adorno of softening the Marxist edge of the man, and a vast readership woke up in the heat of that argument. Then came the strangest mercy of all, 4 decades on. The most advanced drafts of his enormous study of 19th century Paris had seemed lost for good. But in 1981, the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, sifting through the Bataille papers at the French National Library, uncovered a great mass of material in Walter's own hand. The missing manuscripts had simply sat there, untouched, surviving the war and the occupation and 40 years of dusty obscurity. He had once mused that for great writers, finished works weigh lighter than the fragments they labor over all their lives. And that broken, unfinished state was exactly what gave it a strange second life. Decades after Walter's lonely death at the border, these salvaged fragments began to drift out into a world utterly changed. His careful study of shop windows, of solitary wanderers, of the drug-like pull of things behind glass, suddenly described an age that had not yet arrived. An age of glowing screens and scrolling thumbs and desire, engineered on a scale he could only have dreamed. The forgotten man was about to become a prophet. Chapter 13. The Rise of the Desiring Machine. So, we come to the strangest part of the whole story. A man who finished almost nothing, whose work was nearly lost forever, somehow ended up writing the exact blueprint of the world you woke up in this morning. Here, I want to step out of the narrative for just a moment. Usually, at the end of an episode, I use the last chapter to examine a subject's legacy and how it connects to today. But Walter's legacy requires something different. Because his work remains so incredibly relevant to our current moment, it demands a slightly longer, more in-depth exploration than usual. In these final 2 chapters, you might notice I repeat a few of the concepts we've already gone over. I hope you'll forgive the repetition. I deliberately held off on drawing these direct modern connections earlier because I didn't want to ruin the tragic, unfolding narrative of Walter's actual life. But I want to return to those ideas now to see how directly they speak to our present reality. I hope you'll bear with me as we examine just how breathtakingly relevant his work remains. Because as we find ourselves standing in our own moment of danger, watching the terrifying resurgence of global fascism, Walter's politics are more important, more pertinent, and more timely than ever. And yet, the text that holds the blueprint for our modern world, the great, unfinished masterpiece they found by accident, seems at first glance to be about something comically small, a history of 19th century shopping arcades. But for Walter, their significance cannot be overstated. He didn't just see shops at the birth of a machine, and he realized that if a system can figure out how to engineer a society's desires, and if it can capture their attention to do it, it can completely rewire their minds. To begin, we look at the city before the shopping arcade arrived. If you needed a thing, you went out into the mud and the shouting to fetch that one thing, and then you came home again. Buying was a chore, a task you completed and left behind. The arcade changed the whole nature of the act. These were entire streets roofed in glass and iron, lit by gas lamps and lined with shops. They were dry when it rained, warm when it was cold. It took the dreary business of shopping and turned it into something you might do for pleasure, somewhere lovely enough that you came simply to be inside it. You wandered. You looked into one bright window, and then the one beside it, and then the one after that, with no particular plan. And here is the entire trick of the place, the terrifying mechanism Walter diagnosed. You came in wanting nothing at all, and the building's whole purpose was to send you home wanting things that had never once crossed your mind. The desire was not waiting inside you to be satisfied. It was manufactured in you, right there on the floor. Walter saw that this was the engine at the heart of modern capitalism. And everything still to come, all the way down to the screen in your pocket, is that exact same machine, learning over a century to do its job perfectly. Walter theorized that this new economy of desiring lowered a kind of sleep over an entire society, and that inside this sleep it switched something very old back on. The shop window became a little altar. The new thing in it glowed with the same pull that idols and old gods once held over people. A whole civilization moving about, half dreaming, worshipping objects and never noticing it was happening. A new dream sleep fell over Europe, he wrote, and, with it, a reactivation of mythic powers. Now, fast forward to today. What once took iron, glass, and a whole city block now takes a few lines of code. The feed on the screen in your pocket is the desiring machine made perfect. The endless scroll is an arcade with no walls and no end, an infinite corridor running right there in your hand. Except this arcade is built for you alone. The windows rearrange themselves while you watch, learning exactly what stops your thumb, sorting the raw stuff of your own behavior back into a dream world you somehow cannot put down. To keep you wanting, the machine requires the single most valuable resource left on Earth, your absolute, unbroken attention. This is exactly the cognitive trap Walter diagnosed a century ago. He believed the very way human beings take in the world is not fixed forever, but gets reshaped by how we happen to live. The mode of human sense perception changes, he wrote, with humanity's entire mode of existence. He saw it starting with the cinema, where a painting asked you to stand still and sink slowly into it. Film hurled images past you quicker than you could hold them, and slow looking gave way to what he called distraction. What the cinema began, the smartphone finished. Watch your own thumb slide every second or two. A face, a joke, a catastrophe, an advert, a war, flick, 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 gone, before any single one of them truly lands. Your nervous system is held in a state of permanent low alarm, waiting for the next random hit of delight or fury. Once a mind lives like that, it loses the knack for slow, still, absorbed thought. You are left, in Walter's perfect phrase, as the kind of onlooker who inspects everything and absorbs nothing. The public is an examiner, he wrote, but an absent-minded one. Your wanting was taken first. Now your looking has been taken too, your attention harvested as raw data, your very way of seeing rebuilt to keep you staring at the glass. But to keep this massive extraction engine running, the feed has a fatal flaw. It needs an infinite, never-ending supply of new things for you to look at, and it cannot possibly create it all itself. So it relies on a terrifyingly elegant solution, the surest way to keep you hooked and to gather the raw material the machine needs to survive is to convince you to willingly put your own life on display. The watcher must be persuaded to step inside the glass and become the watched. And that is exactly where Walter goes next. Chapter 14. How a failed critic conquered the world. How do you convince an entire society to willingly put itself on display? Walter saw the blueprint almost a century ago. You remember his take on the early cinema, how the camera stripped away the actor's living presence, so the studios manufactured the celebrity as a replacement to sell tickets. Walter knew the cult of this movie star was just a profitable illusion, however, offering what he called not the unique aura of the person, but the spell of the personality, the phony spell of a commodity. But here comes the part he could never have predicted. What the studios once did for a handful of stars, the machine now demands of every one of us. You are expected to manufacture a glow, Build a brand around your own ordinary life and project it outward for strangers to consume. Your face, your breakfast, your heartbreak, all of it transformed into raw material, sitting on a shelf under the lights. And all the while, you've become two people at once. The actor down on the stage of your own life, and the manager up in the booth, arms folded, watching the performance and judging the taking. The story you share is tossed off as something light and disposable, yet it sits forever on a company's servers, logged and weighed. The verdict comes back wearing the cold face of a number. Likes, views, follows. A self that must be endlessly produced and churned out without rest until the individual becomes a machine of self-reproduction, and the cruelty of it lies in the fact that it never switches off. A film star could eventually drive home, peel the mask away, and just be a tired person eating dinner. You cannot. The mask is your account, and your account is awake while you sleep. Walter saw a hopeful side to all this too, and we shouldn't forget it. He watched the new mass media begin to crumble the old wall between the artist and the crowd. Ordinary people, he noticed, were starting to talk back, write back, make things of their own. The barrier between the one who writes and the one who merely reads was beginning to give way. At any moment, he wrote, the reader is ready to turn into a writer. And for one shining stretch of years, it came true. The early internet, where anyone at all could publish a thought on a blog and find an audience for it. But look what became of that gift. The great flood of self-expression degenerated into data for harvesting. Every confession and every styled photograph and every late-night opinion turned into unpaid labor, fuel ladled into machines that study us so they can sell to us with ever sharper aim. The promise was real, and then it was captured. Which leaves us standing at the edge of the most dangerous question this whole story has been circling toward. What happens when that same machinery, having swallowed our desires and our attention, and now the very self, gets turned at last upon politics? What happens when someone trained to perform their life as a brand enters the political arena? What do? They do the only thing they have been conditioned to do. They treat it like everything else in the feed, as content, as a vibe to share, an aesthetic to slip on, and a team to cheer for. And a population that experiences politics as pure sensation and pure spectacle happens to be the precise population that fascism has hungered after since the very beginning. This is the sleight of hand Walter identified a century ago. What fascism does is to give the masses something enormous to feel, pride and fury and belonging, and a glorious enemy to hate, while leaving the only things that matter entirely untouched. Questions of who owns the wealth or who holds the power are ignored completely. Instead, we get the aestheticization of politics, as he called it, the turning of the political into theatre, a show you experience with your gut instead of a real contest over real things. As we say earlier, in Walter's time now the stage was the Nuremberg rally, the torchlight and the banners, a million bodies swaying as one creature. The 21st century asks for only one small revision. The rally went digital, the torches became viral clips, the banners became memes, the roaring multitude became the online mob. Don't waste your strength fighting over money and power, the right says. Fight over the symbols, fight over the vibe and the identity, the culture war. The crowd receives a thrilling, never-ending parade of fresh enemies to rage against, and the architecture of who actually owns the country never shifts by a single inch. That is the con, said plainly. Maximum feeling with zero change. And as Walter pointed out, a politics built on pure feeling carries a fatal hunger in its design. The feeling must continually climb. A crowd thrilled yesterday demands a deeper thrill today, a larger enemy, a more total sense of destiny. The show is condemned to escalate forever, and Walter saw exactly where that road runs out. There exists only one spectacle grand enough to say to people completely drunk on feeling, one drama vast enough to hand them the ultimate sense of sacrifice and glory without altering who owns what. It is war. A society that has swapped real change for the warmth of belonging will, in the end, reach for the biggest thrill there is and call it destiny. This is why the 1930s are shouting at us across the decades. Walter had a name for moments shaped precisely like our own. The moment of danger, he called it, when the past suddenly flares up like a struck match, an urgent warning you must seize before it gutters out. The work is to read the warning correctly, and Walter is the one who taught us how to read. The mechanism he lays out is simple. As we saw earlier, liberalism has a fatal blind spot, a deep and abiding faith in progress. It believes history is a train gliding naturally upward, and that real barbarism was left behind us long ago. When the authoritarian spectacle rises up, the liberal sees a temporary glitch, a pothole that patience will smooth flat. But fascism, Walter warned, is no such glitch. It is a fully modern disease built with the exact same tools of our technological progress to build its nightmares. And while it does so, the liberal keeps waiting for the train of history to right itself, right up to the moment it sails over the cliff. The second reason why liberalism fails to stop fascism cuts deeper still. Liberalism isn't merely blind to the machine, but is its devoted caretaker. The whole apparatus Walter identified, the manufactured desire and the harvested attention and the self made into a product, is the engine of the very economic order that liberalism exists to guard. That engine is precisely what manufactures the captured, spectacle-starved crowd in the first place. So liberalism cannot bring itself to name the danger, because it tends the very ground in which fascism takes root, watering it faithfully, insisting all the while that everything is perfectly fine. So, what does Walter ask of us, this man who saw the entire machine laid bare from inside a world that was already preparing to kill him? He presses one tool into our hands. He tells us to let go of the old hope that revolution is the locomotive of history, hauling humanity onward toward paradise. Walter turned it inside out. Marx says revolutions are the locomotive of world history, he wrote. But perhaps it is quite otherwise. Perhaps revolutions are an attempt by the passengers on this train, namely the human race, to activate the emergency brake. Stop waiting for progress to rescue you. Reach up and pull the brake. He leaves us two last instructions, and they are the note we end on. Read history against the grain. Refuse the gleaming story the victors tell, take your place beside the crushed and the forgotten, and load the buried past like live ammunition to fire at the comfortable lies of the present. And against fascism's dressing up of an unjust world as beautiful theatre, he demands the exact reversal. Don't aestheticize politics, politicize art instead. Don't melt politics down into a pretty show. Forge culture into a genuine weapon for genuine change. His life's work survives as a glittering broken mosaic, a thing each of us must piece back together alone in our own moment of danger. The penniless, homeless critic who died at a border crossing witty, a briefcase full of prophecy, ended up conquering the world for a single reason. He understood, earlier and more deeply than almost anyone who has ever drawn breath, exactly how the world that was coming would try to conquer us. And before he went, he left the tools behind. That is where our story ends. If you've stayed with us all the way to here, thank you. It means a great deal. And once again, An enormous thank you to all our YouTube members and Patreons. Your support is the reason these videos exist. If you'd like to join them, you'll find the links in the description below. And if this episode moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe. It genuinely helps other curious minds discover the channel. Until next time, this has been History After Dark. Goodbye.